with Rita and anybody else that may come in. Uh, the thing that we want to remember in all of these discussions on the history for the first 200 years is that the Jesus movement, I'm not calling it the church yet, it's too early in that process to call it the church, and it's way too early to call it Christianity. Uh, we're saying that the Jesus movement did not really become a church as we understand anything about a church and Christianity until the third century. I mean, it was very much in formation, which is a new way to think for me and probably for a lot of us. But that's the better research that we're into. Uh, but the Jesus movement started uh, after Jesus was off the scene. Uh, we talked last week about what I call gestation, the gestation of the Jesus movement, which was really the story of Jesus. It was a history, 400 years of Jewish history, the Roman Empire, and all of the struggles that the Jews had for all those many years. Uh, and then the activity of Jesus, the Jesus of history. And I said then, and I say it again, the way I phrase it, we have two Jesuses. We have the Jesus of the New Testament, and my thing there is that's the Jesus that walked on water and fed 5,000 with just a few pieces of food. And then we have the Jesus of Nazareth, the Jesus of Galilee, who had a life. He had a life. Uh, I've said many times, my good friend Joy Hakeem read my novels about Jesus, and it was her who said, I never thought Jesus had a life, but he did. He had a mother and a father, however you want to interpret that. Probably was born in Nazareth, grew up there, and I think became, along the way, increasingly anxious and disturbed by the brutality of the Roman occupation. He also was concerned about the abuse of the temple system. The people of the temple, the high priest and all, could harass, but they could not really bodily hurt like the Roman army could. So anyway, all of that against the background of the Roman Empire. But when Jesus died on the cross, uh, of course, his friends were devastated by that. They loved him; he loved them. They walked with him up and down the hills of Galilee into those villages. Uh, went to Passover in Jerusalem. In some ways, I say it might have been the first and only time that Jesus actually went to Jerusalem and Passover. It was 80 to 100 miles, and he had to walk. There was no other means of conveyance. And that's a long walk. And most of the people of Galilee lived in poverty. They may not have been destitute yet, but they lived in poverty. And to take a week or so to go to the Passover, spend 4 or 5 days in Jerusalem, camping out or something, and go back was a big stretch. So I don't, it, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus only went, they record only one visit of Jesus to Jerusalem, which was that last time. John in his gospel has Jesus going a few more times than that. Uh, we talk about those first many years of the Bible being silent about what was happening, and to say there was no Bible to be silent. Uh, as they had access to Hebrew scriptures, probably some access to what has come to be called the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, the Greek Hebrew scriptures. Uh, but they really didn't know much about that either. I mean, they didn't have much access day by day in the synagogues and all of that. So there was no Bible. it would be years before even Paul's letters began to emerge. So they were these companions of Jesus who had walked with him, who were devastated at his death. They were pretty much on their own. What do they do now? Uh, and I can imagine how devastated they were when he was gone. You know what, the great friend that they loved, he loved. Some of them had even begun to hope that maybe he was the Messiah, the long promised Messiah. Who knows what they were thinking? But he was gone, and so I can imagine that they really had to struggle to see what they wanted to do next, if anything. Did they did they run from the Romans? Did they hide? Uh, did they just fold their wings and go away? Apparently, over some period of time, weeks, months, some of them at least. I can imagine some of the women more than the men, maybe, uh, began to think back what Jesus did, uh, what he said. Uh, might have been kind of fuzzy because they were not writing it down as he said it. But for whatever they could not remember what he said, they could remember clearly what he did, the kinds of deeds that he did among them, which was a compassion and caring and particularly inclusiveness. Jesus apparently broke Jewish barriers, the traditional barriers, by consorting with non-Jews, even Romans, and he ate with them. And we hear echoes of that in the Gospels, that the strict Pharisees and the people like that took exception to Jesus just eating with anybody. Uh, in those years you were not, if you did not eat with a non-Jew. That's just one of the rules of tradition that they had maintained. But Jesus ate with whoever, whoever invited him. There's a lot of stuff in the New Testament about, in the Gospels, about that.
Really
And they,
great guy.
but mainly, I think they understood his love for the people and his compassion and his willingness to reach out to anybody and everybody that he felt needed him or that came along. So my perception is, and reading what I've done, is bit by bit, they, as somebody has said, they got Jesus. To understand, they began to understand what he was saying, but they understood that in terms of what he did. What he did began to let them understand what he was talking about, in opening up the Hebrew scriptures to them in a new kind of way and all. So we don't really know that, how all of that took place, except we can imagine what was happening. We do know history shows that something of great moment was afoot. Uh, Something that turned the world upside down happened between the ministry of Jesus in, say, 25 and the death of Jesus in 30, and the next 2 centuries. Something of really great significance happened in those years. Uh, and it was the development of the Jesus movement that became the church and that became Christianity. And how did that happen? Uh, I think it happened one at a time. Uh, the uh, Mary Magdalene, who was a great friend of Jesus. I don't know what I've got there. Anyway, uh, so Rita's friend gets a group of her friends at her house, and they begin to talk. They really don't know much about Jesus. Some of them might have remembered him in those early days, uh, but they had no theology. They had memory of his deeds. Some of them might have remembered some of the things that he said, but what they mainly did was begin to emulate what he did, which was fundamentally an attitude of compassion to one another. It was not a time of compassion. The temple system out of Jerusalem was a great institution that all the Jews everywhere loved, but it was not warm and fuzzy, apparently. And the Romans certainly were not compassionate. There was not even a hint of compassion among the Roman army. Uh, and people were struggling. The Romans were being increasingly difficult, taking their farms and all. And so a group of people at Rita's house who seemed to really care for one another and stood in the gap with one another really began to catch on, I think. And so one after the other, they began to do this. And so it moved from Galilee, where Jesus was, uh, to Jerusalem. Uh, we have that great line in the first chapter of Acts when Jesus tells his friends there on the Mount of Olives, "You will receive power, and you will be my witnesses in Judea and all." And by the time the book of Acts was written in 100 or whatever it was, all of that was already happening. So the book of Acts talks like it is about to happen when in fact it is already happening. And by the time Acts was written in whenever, 80, 90, 100, whenever it was, the Jesus movement was small, still very small, but well underway. Uh, so it's a fascinating process there of one by one by one by one that it began to move out. Uh, we think of theology for 15, 1800 years. Great minds have developed theology. Who was Jesus? Was he all holy? Was he all divine? Was he all human? All the kind of questions that I contemplated in seminary uh, were not yet being considered, at least by the folks up and down the streets. They were too busy finding a new life for themselves, making a living, trying to find a way to get around the brutality of the Roman Empire. And so, but what they did was they cared for each other, and they became a bulwark against the brutality of the times. And that, I think, that more than anything else, initially attracted people to these Jesus groups. They met in homes. And when I talk about homes, we think about neat little cottages with picket fences and roses growing. That was not it. That Jesus probably grew up in a one-room stone and mud hut kind of thing in Nazareth. That's what they had. If they lived in a city like Sepphoris or Rome or somewhere like that, uh, they typically lived in 4 and 5 story tenements, uh, and they were. This is how I think how it began. Uh, so anyway, this is how it was happening. I don't know what our pictures were previously of how this thing happened. I can remember in years gone by reading the book of Acts and studying it all, I began to ask myself, was Paul the only one out there doing this? And now I'm discovering after these months of really delightful reading and study that there were many, many, many people out there uh, sort of willy-nilly, serendipitously creating clubs. What they were not churches, they were clubs. The way that the Roman Greco-Roman society organized itself was they formulated around clubs, interest clubs, uh, weavers or tent makers or whatever their job in life was. They created clubs around that. And so as the Jesus groups as they began to proliferate, they were considered in the first decades clubs. So that's why a lot of times I call them Jesus clubs. They were just just clusters, and they fit in with Roman Greco society because that's the way the typical not in Palestine probably, but beyond that, in the larger Roman world, Greek people gathered around the ideas of vocation and interest. We would have chess clubs, checkers clubs. You'd have all kind of clubs that they organized around. And so the Jesus groups that gradually, steadily proliferated, organized around Jesus. What memory they had of Jesus or what they had heard about Jesus. And we'll look at this in a minute, but there was no organization. There was no hierarchy, no bishops, anything like that for decades into this early movement. Uh, they they wanted, I think that I've said it even today several times, the people under Roman army occupation needed the feeling that somebody cared for them, that they could care one for the other. And that's what really began to gather them. And the other essential aspect of that whole thing was eating, meals, eating. Uh, that's always been important. We any big celebration, we have a meal. We still do that. That's just the way we organize. Thanksgiving is a meal. Christmas is a big meal. Birthdays are a big meal. Uh, and those folks organized around meals, eating. And then what was happening was, and Paul echoes this in some of his writings, uh, the meal, the meals were not just Lord's Supper; they were full-scale meals, and the power of that method was not everybody had enough to eat. So but over time, they began to know if they showed up for the Thursday Jesus group, there'd be a pretty good meal there also. So there was a double pull there. They knew they'd be welcome. They knew that anybody could come, women and men. There was no difference between the women and the men in those groups.
Over here.
What now? Hello? Somebody was talking and I missed it. I was talking too much. Okay. Anyway, that was a big thing. And gradually they began to worship. Now they could not, by and large, most of them could not read and write. It's not important. So when they got a document, maybe from Paul or somebody had to read that to them. But it's fun to read about all of that. What researchers have come up with, the worship, and they just met willy-nilly whenever they went. Wasn't any idea of Sunday or anything like that at first. They got together and ate, and they sang. If somebody could read something from the Hebrew Bible, they did. And gradually, apparently over the decades, they sort of fell into a worship routine. But they didn't have any kind of thing to read unless somebody read them something. So they developed worship around community. What worked for each other is what they began to do. So they did all kinds of we know they sang. We know that they could sing. That they probably had some access to the Hebrew Psalms, so they incorporated those. It was apparently a very warm thing. And then another piece that I picked up reading, they argued. Fancy that. They argued. Nobody, and sometimes they said, the books that I read, the writing, that the arguments became so vigorous that they had to have kind of a sergeant at arms to say enough. And you say, well, they didn't. But then you read again what Paul wrote later, and Paul echoes in there a lot of arguments. Could they eat meat offered to idols? What did the woman could and could not wear into the assembly? all of those kinds of peripheral issues they argued about, apparently. Uh, but they kept meeting, they kept coming together, and they found a community, I guess, that would allow them to argue without getting beat up. Who knows? I don't know what all that was. The point is, it was happening bit by bit by bit. There was no uniformity. Theology was not there yet. Who was Jesus? They could not have given you the fine points of Christology like we try to do now. Uh, but they heard enough about what Jesus did that they liked it. The community, the inclusiveness, eating together, caring for one another, all of the things that they heard about Jesus, they liked. And they gathered around his deeds. The words that are remembered would come later. We'll talk about that at another point. But it was so amorphous, but very vital and very vibrant. And it gradually scattered and spread throughout the Roman Empire, uh, bit by bit, just bit by bit. Uh, and very diverse. They had varying ideas about who Jesus was and what they ought to be doing. And when I was early in my seminary training, we had the idea that those early groups were just wonderful. They didn't fight, they didn't scrap, they didn't disagree.
Well done, Mr. King.
Oh, thank
We
you. Wait a minute,
know
don't go
now
away. Can you
that
make this a little louder?
they were, it was not all that happy, but they
Those-
stayed together. They battled out whatever their differences were. And probably if one group became too angry, they could just go start another group. That's what we've done all these centuries anyway. For years and years, we would say that Baptist churches grew by splitting. They get mad, didn't like what the preacher said, or didn't like where you put the water fountain, and so they go create another group. And
Wait, where's
we've
the
done that all of
sound coming from?
these many centuries. Okay. So this is the scattered way. Okay, the point is it was very serendipitous. That's just the point. Uh, one of the writers says that the Jesus movement, that Christianity from its beginning was not inevitable. We look back and think it was, and we impose a theology on that Holy Spirit and that kind of motif. But it was not guaranteed. It could have, with Jesus' death, if those first 15 or 20 people had just said, oh, it's all over, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. It would not have gotten started. But we're deeply indebted in 2025 to a double handful of women and men from that first decades. Come in, Mary, uh, who who decided they were going to keep this thing going. They were not going to give it up. They were going to maintain what they had heard and felt from Jesus. So that's the heart of how this whole thing happened. That's sort of the birth. The benchmarks to remember, and we're going to look at some more in just a minute. The benchmark for me is the Jesus movement did not start until after the crucifixion. Jesus was laying the foundations for it. The big debate was Jesus trying to start a movement. I don't think so. I think he was just in the middle of working with the people. How long did that last? We don't know. 1 year, 5 years, but not long. And suddenly he was gone. He was murdered by the Romans and the temple people. Uh, but what he did was of such moment and impact in the villages of Galilee that it stuck, and the people who loved him, who were close to him, who started, who decided upon his death, they would not let Jesus die, if you please. They would keep doing what he had started. So that's kind of the benchmark for me in this whole thing is how these double handfuls, not very many, women and men, even though the New Testament does not give women much place here, we know now that women were very much involved in this, uh, and and were all along until finally the Catholic groups, as they formed, squashed the women publicly, but women have never gone away. You folks have been with us for all these many centuries, and I'm grateful. So that's kind of where we are there. Uh, and I found a piece that I want to share with you. The six characteristics, and this is another benchmark. This would be on your page 11 on your notes there. Um, the book that I relied heavily on for a lot of this after Jesus to Christianity says that the scholars who've done all of this stuff have from their research. And let me pause there to say how indebted I am to scholars of unknown numbers, women and men, for the last 200 years or so, who have devoted themselves to reconstructing what happened 2,000 years ago. Now, some of their conclusions we might disagree with, some of their conclusions are kind of startling, maybe, but I'm grateful to these devoted women and men who have spent their lives, really their lives, trying to get to the bottom of this, not to tear it down in any kind of way, but to rebuild, to restructure. I may have told you that I've got a little book coming out in a few months, and the publisher had done a blurb, what is Maddox up to? And the publisher said, uh, the author is trying to dismantle everything that he has known in the past. And I quickly wrote them back, no, I'm not trying to dismantle. I'm trying to build upon. I'm grateful for every little bit of growing up as a Baptist boy over here in Clarkston. Uh, and what I've done is build on that. I'm not trying to tear up anything. Sometimes it might sound like that I'm trying to dismantle, but I'm really trying to build on what. So that's what these wonderful scholars have done. Uh, so scholarship is important. Doesn't mean you have to buy everything they say, but you pay careful attention. These folks have spent decades learning languages and history and taking all kind of gaff and writing books that nobody much ever read or anything. Anyway, scholarship is important, really important. And they have isolated six characteristics that were more or less a part of these Jesus groups. Not every group had all six of these things, but it's very interesting to look at this. Uh, so the first thing that I've got in bold print here is these groups resisted the Roman Empire. They found subtle ways to resist the Roman Empire, the Roman army. Rome ruled the world. And as long as you cooperated with Rome, Rome wanted to leave you alone. But if you begin to think for yourself or go outside of the empire's box in any way, you could be in serious trouble. And the people knew this. So these are not just the Jews, this is all over the Roman Empire. And so they found subtle ways to resist the empire. Uh, they refused to take it all seriously in ways that we can just imagine. They just resisted the empire. And one of the main things that comes out to me is one of the main ways they resisted the Roman Empire was in becoming Jesus' people. Now, Jesus, the word was out throughout all of this. that Jesus, this very good man who loved, healed, fed, and everything else, was killed by the Roman army. This very good man was crucified by the Roman army, and he was Jewish. And the Romans never quite figured out who the Jews were. Uh, and suddenly, the man that Rome killed ignominiously on the cross became the hero of this Jesus group. And so this was a very strong, subtle, but very strong, in your face to the Roman Empire. You thought you got rid of Jesus. No, you didn't. You might have killed him, but he's still very much with us. So this was a very strong, subtle way that these Jesus groups resisted the empire in many other ways. We know now that one of the ways that slaves in America resisted the owners was slow down. You know, uh, they would, instead of hoeing fast, they hoed slow. If the overseer was, so there are a lot of ways to resist power, and they found all kind of ways to resist power, which is to say again, don't ever forget the power of the Roman Empire. The other thing that these people have isolated is they practiced gender bending. Uh, there were very established ways that men and women, male and female, operated in society. Uh, and for a lot of very important reasons, uh, these Jesus groups found ways to go against that tradition. Uh, and we know that some of them, probably pretty radical in by many standards, uh, they they refused to marry. Uh, and one of the early martyrs, Hecla Precla, I forget her name. I should look that up. In the legends, would not marry, and she was finally executed, I think, because she wouldn't marry. Uh, they just didn't want to do that. Remember, they didn't know it yet, but Paul would be saying in Galatians that in Christ there is no male, no female, no slave, no free. That gorgeous statement that Paul made. Uh, Women began to cut their hair, uh, and even some women began to wear men's clothes as a way to show their identity. Uh, and the whole idea of gender became fuzzy in there. And that didn't last terribly long because for long they were back in their strict roles. I'm glad for the most of my life that you women have carved out your own life. You have, in that sense, you have bent gender roles. Uh, the very fact that all three of you seated in here today are wearing pants is another very big sign of gender bending. When Linda and I first married, well, even at Baylor, when we were there in the 50s, late 50s, girls could not be seen on the campus in pants. Uh, and if you were going to gym, you could wear shorts, but you had to wear a trench coat over those shorts, you know. Uh, and then Linda, I don't know when she started wearing pants, I guess whenever you all did. But our early pictures of Linda is in a pretty dress with a hat and gloves and a matching pocketbook, all of that kind of stuff. So you folks here today are bending the gender. I think it's a great idea. But they did that. They did that in those days, which set the tone for the liberation and freedom that they would enjoy. Uh, the other part that I found very fascinating is they lived in chosen families. Uh, and what happened there was uh, family was very important. The pater familias, the father, the family was very important. The father could tell the girl who she could marry and who couldn't marry, and on and on and on. But with the disruption, the consistent decades-long disruption of the Roman occupation, a lot of times the men in the family were snatched away. Rome was always building something, and the men, they would come into a village and they would grab up 10 or 15 men and take them to another part of the country to build the aqueduct or the arena or whatever they were building. And so that dramatically disrupted families. And so they began to live as best they could. The man was gone. Uh, so and the chosen family, that however it worked. Uh, and we see that today, very much today. Uh, People live in chosen families more and more. I don't know what numbers are, but it's statistically available that more and more women are choosing uh, to either have a man impregnate or artificial insemination because she doesn't want to marry. She wants a child and wants to raise the child, but she does not want to marry. So suddenly you've got the woman choosing that she will raise the child. We've got a good friend that helps us here with our exercise on a regular basis. And talking with him the other day, he said he raised his daughter. I don't know. He said her mother, the biological mother, wanted nothing to do with her. She'd never been in the picture. And so he raised his daughter, chosen family, you see. Uh, and we hear a lot of times about uh, young people have babies and then they can't raise the baby. So suddenly grandmother or granddaddy are raising the baby. That's the idea of the chosen family. Uh, when I worked at the White House, uh, the White House, the president decided that we would sponsor the White House Council on Families. I mean, a White House conference on families. In the midst of that, we discovered, for me, I had to begin to ask myself, what is a family? And some of the hard right people began to complain because we were not doing a man and a woman and a picket fence house as a family. And we said, no, that's not right. There are too many single women and men raising children, on and on and on. What is a family? A family is almost what you say it is. So they lived in these chosen families, very important to provide the kind of care for children that needed that kind of thing. Uh, Another thing that's interesting, they claimed belonging to Israel. Remember, they didn't have a New Testament. The New Testament was way down the line. Even in the second century, the documents were still floating around out there. So what they had was, whatever they had was the Hebrew Bible. And so they began to pick up on the stories of the Hebrew Bible, the great Adam and Eve, Abraham, and all like that. And so big swaths of them became closely identified with the idea of Hebrew and Israel. It's also helpful to remember that from the 6th century BCE, that the people who became Jews scattered throughout the Mediterranean, the Roman world. And so everywhere you live, no matter where you live, in the midst of your town and village, there was nearly always a group of what people who became Jews because they had been forced to move. Uh, that's been a big thing in our lifetime is the Jews all over the world wanted to go back to Israel. But so but next door was a group of Jews, and Jesus was a Jew, and so you begin to get acquainted with them, and your little group might have become more closely identified with Jews and Jewish history because you did not have anything else. no other writing. Now, Paul, in the midst of that, no HP printers, nothing like that. So there was just no literature, no writing. We can't imagine that, but that was a part of it. Uh, they had diverse organizational structures. There was no way to organize. It would be a while before, as the movement began to sort of stabilize and solidify, that they began to have leaders, pastors, and people like that. But group, they organized like they wanted to, whatever worked for them, whatever location they were, they had their own sense of organization. Before this Jesus group began to institutionalize itself into uh, organizations. We've seen a lot of that in the last 75, 100 years around the world in the number of denominational churches that have grown up. And here in Gainesville, some of the strongest churches, the biggest numbers of churches, are non-denominational. They don't affiliate with any established organization. What is interesting is they begin to create their own organization. Uh, Free Chapel out here on the edge of town, big, huge church, has satellite churches everywhere, I mean, scattered all around. So we do organize ourselves. We might kind of float along in whatever kind of organization we want, but eventually we organize. We want to have like people. We want to have, somebody wants to be the boss, somebody wants to be the head pastor, all of that. We do organize. But in those opening days, they had no set organization. They just did their own thing. Uh, and they operated on oral traditions. Again, remember, no writings, a little bit of the Hebrew Bible, but there were no writings, no nothing. And it was scattered all around. It was happening over there, it's happening over here, it's happening over there. People were writing, but there was no cohesion to that. The further people get into these kinds of studies, they realize what kind of writing was taking place. But it was just episodic. Dean wrote to Mary, and Mary wrote to Rita, and I didn't hear about it. I mean, that it was just so sketchy like that. So if my group is off in the boonies out here, I knew what I knew of Jesus and I liked what I heard, but we did our own thing. You know, we did our own thing. Then somebody like Paul would come along and do some teaching, and we would say, "Hey, I like what he said," or "I like this or what he said." So you begin gradually to incorporate that into what you did. It would be decades, even a century or so, before there was any kind of of writing, of substantial writing that people had. And it didn't bother them because most of them couldn't read and write anyway. It was that was no big thing. Uh, we we know now that it gradually changed as it became more proliferated and organized. Uh, they so they had these persistent pieces that they clung to, and that kind of organized or framed their lives. Uh, it's a fascinating think about how all of that happened in those days. Uh, it's also a good reminder that the Greco-Roman world did not lack for religion. The Roman Empire was profoundly religious. They had state religion that was vitally important to the life of the empire, the life of the kingdom and republic, and finally the empire. At one point, Julius Caesar in his day was the Pontifex Maximus of the Roman state religion. It's interesting, the Pope is now called the Pontifex Maximus. But so Roman religion was very important. We've seen the movies and all of the Vestal Virgins. And women, a few women were selected to be the Vestal Virgins, and that was something they did for life. If a Vestal Virgin committed sex with a man, then she was stoned. I mean, but they lived luxuriously. And there were all kind of gods, there was no one God, there was all kind of gods. And every household, or I suppose nearly every household, had their own series of household gods. And the father, the paterfamilias, led regular oblations and worship and prayers and offerings to this and that God that you had in your house. So part of what we discover from the early Jesus movement was the Jesus movement moved into a world of religion, but they had to compete with the world of religion also. We still have to do that today. We have to compete with secularism or whatever else we deal with. So it was a very religious world. Paul talks about in his sermon in Athens that the monument to the unknown God, somebody came along and said, well, we might have missed somebody, so we'll make a monument here, a stone to the unknown God, just in case we miss somebody. We don't want to get in trouble because we missed somebody. Anyway, that's it in a kind of a nutshell there, of the birth of the movement. Jesus started it. Whatever else he wanted to do, the life, the ministry, the activity of Jesus started it. When he was killed, when he was executed, when he was martyred, a group of people, small group of people, just like you folks here in the room today, and those might be listening in, ordinary people started this whole thing. Now, some groups want to think it was just the apostles and all. No, that they didn't know they were apostles anyway. But ordinary people who understood what Jesus was trying to do, the compassion and love and caring and all, is what implemented the Jesus movement. Theology would come, organization would come. And it's important that provides the framework, but they did not start out with elaborate theology. So that's kind of where we are today. Next week, we'll wrap up next week, and we will talk about expansion. We'll talk about more, we'll get into more Paul, who Paul was, what he did, and that whole thing. And we will also look at the early writings, which would be the Gospels and other writings that we know about now. We will look at them more carefully as a way to kind of wrap up what we've been doing. So there we go.
So you said we would talk later, and that's what you meant.
Right. We'll do it next week, more fully next week. It's a fascinating piece there. A lot of it we have to do with Paul, his imagination. One of my favorite scholars is a guy named Dominic Crossan. Professor Crossan was Irish, raised Roman Catholic, became a Jesuit priest, a scholar priest along the way, left the church, married, and over these many decades, he's become one of the two or three leading Jesus of Nazareth scholars. And what Crossan has led in doing, I love the phrase, he did cross-cultural anthropology. Cross-cultural anthropology. He takes what we can know from this, and this, or what we can reasonably know. And out of that, he and others like him create a gestalt, which is the psychology word, a, a, a body there, uh, that you add everything up and you get a picture. So that's a lot of what Crossan and others like that have done. What they can research from the times and all would have produced somebody like Jesus. So that's all of that there. Yeah, but I don't think Paul was into that. Uh, but it is a fascinating study. Of course, Paul, next to Jesus, is the most important person in Christianity for the last 1,500 years. Uh, but it's a lot of interesting stuff in and out about Paul that we'll talk about next week, and also the Gospels. Uh, Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, I think, in that order, we'll look at. And also quickly the evolution of the New Testament, of the Christian Testament, which did not finally become authorized by the Catholic Church until the late fourth century. But it was happening all along the way there. So it's a fascinating process and study. Okay.
All right.